So, happy to have Jason Waite here with us today or tonight. He's an independent curator. He used to be based in New York, but now in this month he turned out to Utrecht in Casco, which is an art institution based in Utrecht. Jason holds an MA in Art and Politics from Goldsmiths College and was a hidden Rubinstein Curatorial Fellow at the Whitney Museum in New York. And his recent projects include The Real Thing at Palais de Tokyo in Paris, many paintings required at the Künste in New York, and the 4 Young Artists Biennale in Bucharest. And he has also contributed to numerous publications, including art papers, glass art, modern painters. And he's here today in the framework of our seminar, like for me and Robin Huge, that we're doing in context module manifestos. And he's not going to talk only about manifests, but also his practice and his projects. So I'm looking forward. Thank you for coming. So, okay,
thank you so much. I'd like to definitely thank you and Romy and others for the invitation. It's very special to come back here. And I have to say that what I wanted to speak about today actually somewhat began here in Zurich this past summer. And what I would like to speak about is actually something new, and it's something that I was working on for this and elsewhere. So thinking about curatorial practice in a way as not only kind of a resuscitation of events, but thinking about formats and places. And I think that potentially the format of the lecture, in a sense, is very helpful for this body of research. So, that being said, I'm going to read in a very Anglo-American way for a short period of hopefully about 20 minutes or so, and then speak about manifestos as leading up to the Maintenance Required show, which came into being this past year as part of the Whitney Independent Study Program and has a relationship with manifestos as will become apparent. I would like to say that this light is very wonderful, that I cannot see you all, so I very much feel like this is very much a performance as much of a lecture as anything else, so please excuse if I seem to be lost in my own world. And also, that being said, if you decide to take a nap, don't worry, I will not see you. So what I'd like to begin with is this image, which is a work in its own way. And it's by Rashkar Mahmoud Mustafa, who's an artist from the north of Iraq and presently I'm studying in London. The work is entitled 5 Plastic Women Protesters and took place in 2011. And the circumstances of the work were the uprising in Iraq on the 21st of February 2011. This is 2 weeks after the fall of Mubarak. And in the north, in Suleimania, which is considered the cultural capital of the north of the Kurdish part of Iraq, there was a protest which then turned violent in the sense that the protesters were shot upon while trying to storm the regional local headquarters of the Kurdish regional party. And this actually began a very vibrant movement. Which was actually one of the longest in the Middle East of that period, lasting 68 days over 3 months. And it focused particularly around corruption, as well as the fact that in Kurdish Iraq there are 2 main parties that control, let's say, the economic flood of money which is coming from oil. So in order to usually get employment, you have to be a part of one of these 2 systems. And the work itself is the fact that during these protests, you can see the 4 of the 5 mannequins here. The protests, as a couple other protests were in the region, were segregated. So you had male protesters forming the largest body in one section, and then women cordoned off in another. So Rashkar was thinking about her role in and around this. And as a form of what we could say positivist critique, she asked artists, her friends, who were also participating in this protest, which was largely fomented, let's say, by artists and intellectuals, to carry 4 mannequins from the store through the male-dominated area, and she ran behind them saying, "Oh, you forgot one, you forgot one." So in and around this performance, and here we can see the women, the representations of women meeting another representation of women, and you can see this red line behind, which separates the gender areas of protest. So beginning with this, I'd like to say that she's, in a way, advocating for a more expansive approach to gender roles, a new political movement, while providing a salient critique of an underlying conservatism and social reproductive norms in the revolutionary sphere. Rashtar Mahmoud Mustafa's mannequins still adorned in their kitschy storefront wares. Extricated from the capitalist forms of exchange, they are paraded into the developing political body of Kurdistan, in the north of Iraq. The context of the uprising explored an emergence of agency in peaceful, large-scale mass protest, and in particular, how these movements can try to think together to produce new ways of distributing power, reclaiming the commons, and finding new structures for living together. While the mannequins can be seen as a helpful, sympathetic action, providing a reflexive look at the means of struggle, and how, while retaining the similar goals in politics, these lifeless plastic model bodies shift and open the new social forms in the square. What seemed a positivist critique at the time now seems foreboding, an indication of a broader shift, one towards the inevitable objectification of the event itself and the people who constitute the square. What is objectified is precisely the fervor and collective energy that is generated when coming together to look into an unknown future. A precarious position where time is measured in seconds and minutes. New worlds emerge and potentials are discussed, debated, and enacted. Bodies sleep in unusual places. Food is shared with hitherto known strangers. And conversations are sparked about diverse realities and desires. This is a fluid, unwielding, uncertain place. It is a flux. It is manifest already of a change of how we interact in society, and a call to extend this transformation into the recalcitrant systems of power. However, the protests in Suleimania ended, as have the other large-scale forms of public social action. While we have seen the end of Tahrir Square, marked by the recent overthrow, where in the aftermath of the square was transmuted from a site to germinate and foster politics and practice-led theory, into a catalyst for the recent bloodshed with thousands killed. In a less stark shift, the encampment in Liberty Square, also known as Zuccotti Park in New York, ended in a nocturnal conclusion, leaving many with their hopes for a new form of politics behind on the concrete benches of the square. In the disorientation of the post-Tahrir, post-Occupy moment, the potential for agency and self-organization has been called into question. However, it is precisely the utility of the square and its reclamation that even seems to be more critical now. And how can we understand the role then of public space moving forward and open other deliberative sites to act as nodes for knowledge production, alternative exchange? In this present moment, if we see it defined as a state of withdrawal, as a time of a reassessment for strategies and shifting of the data lines, how can we find a new meaning in spatial politics? So at the same moment of time of this crisis of public agency in the political sphere, there is an emergence in the art world of an interest in object-oriented ontology. Right? In the writings of Graham Harman, there is a push towards a reordering, so to speak, of the position of humanity in the world, and a breaking down of the hierarchies of being, where all matter, human, animal, pen, glass, is an equal object. Underlying this transformation is the dismantling of the subject-object distinction, the privileging of the subject as the conscious being versus the inanimate objects. And actually, while I was writing this talk, wonderfully, the Art 100 list came out. I don't know if you see this horrible, trashy list every year that Art Review puts out. But amazingly, popping in on number 81 is speculative realism. As a funny note, thankfully, Bard College, which has a curatorial program, is listed above, but even more importantly, Bard College in Hamdale on the Hudson is the resting place for Hannah Arendt. So thankfully we can say, at least in the Art 100 now, Hannah Arendt is a highly solar, higher place than speculative realism does. And thankfully too, what do you always put up as an image for any speaking about theory, especially speculative realism and so right? So I have to thank Art Review 100 for at least providing some visual fodder. On the level of the ontic, objects dependent on humans for significance and meaning is divorced from a Kantian view of human beings having a privileged relationship with objects, explicated by Harman in the Heideggerian turn of the metaphor of the hammer and the object, withdrawing away from its totalized environment to find a singularity in themselves, which is simply to say that objects exist outside of our sphere of perception. Here, relationships are eschewed or denied altogether, replaced by what could be considered a late capitalist infused notion of independence, such as his example of deep rocks colliding in space, an alien world of objects. It's a cold world that they speak of, a language of data that comprises the speculative realist project of a new humanism, or an anti-humanism, as Riz and Wittgenstein would put it. Within this world, there is no space for politics, but rather an insistence on algorithms and programs. This is dovetailed in the sphere of art, with the rise again of the return towards abstract art, thinking about here Waite Guyton, Mark Bradford, and a whole host of others. And yet this return to an early form of modernism and the avant-garde is one that takes with it only the visual accoutrements of that period and strips out any politicality from the works. To uphold these objects as vacant totems, as symbols for a new techno-laden shamanistic way. This way of seeing is engendered in the formal turn back to painting and the anointment of what has been termed post-internet, to new materialism and to the new aesthetic. A techno-shamanistic basket of visual strategies that hold up a Cartesian view of a geometricized world as projected through an individual's lens. And here, of course, we see as the most important kind of key attribute, at least in post-internet in a way, outside of kind of the means of production, which is strongly supposedly critiquing, is this this formalist turn of how we imagine a schematized world in relating to different platforms, and the oscillation in the way of our perspective through these platforms. So I would like to turn to posit a relationship between two seemingly different phenomena, exploring social forms as a means, which will become evident to see how we can consider the object and provide a different path out of this morass. And so here, kind of turning away towards this critique of the present, where can we find reference points for a collective future? Well, I would point to a place not too far away from where we presently are. One of these can be found here in the form of the Landsgemeinde, which I find very ironic that this is the first place I speak about this. I've been speaking about this in certain forums in Asia and in New York for a couple months now, to great awe and wonder to the audiences. Of course, the majority of you will be very familiar with this, so actually I very much look forward to your comments and discussion. That being said, as a brief intro for those of you are not as familiar, the Landsgemeinde is a self-organized assembly which have maintained direct form of democracy for over half a millennium. Here, the Landsgemeinde is the highest legislative body present in 2 cantons. And it is the citizens themselves that contest the liberal democratic notion of the need for representation as a means of mitigating the fear of the so-called mob rule. In a way, I mean, if we could see this as, I don't know, as the beginnings of a joke of how a Swiss mob might unfold in a very ordered way, I think it's a very nice way of kind of contesting other liberal democratic theorists. And the Landsgemeinde communing deliberations all take place in a purpose-built temporary democratic architecture that constitutes a vision of the role of a citizen in public space, where the discussion is open and the vote is a public gesture. Democracy here is observantly participatory, while direct democracy has been theorized in certain circles by David Graeber and others who have looked in Mozambique and Native Americans and other cultures for organizing. The Landsgemeinde potentially has 3 important, unique, and critical attributes. First of all, its location. Located in the heart of Europe, of course. We can see the Landsgemeinde here as quintessentially a Western European project that has been already extant and functioning, which leads to the second point of duration for quite a while. Its longevity is demonstrative of a potential to endure. The notion of any self-organization in public for lasting for more than a day or a month now is extremely helpful, and a potential for all of those thinking about the direction of contemporary social movements. The constant form of dispersing of the Landsgemeinde shows a sustainable rhythm built on a common trust and a will to be together. Here, mutual aid is a historic necessity and one that binds communities together. While claims are made for the geographic uniqueness and idiosyncratic circumstances of these communities, its continuity itself provides its own historical assertiveness. Finally, there is the image. Here it is, here, in the collective form, which provides a figuration rather than a representation, whose iconic value cannot be understated. If we see in the image an unregulated horizon of possibilities, then we can potentially see an alternative modernity unfolding before us. If the Landsgemeinde functions on the epistemological register, then perhaps we can go deeper to explore the ontological. In order to get there, thinking of Walter Benjamin's insistence on the drilling down rather than the excavating can be useful. Whereas the excavation removes the earth and the various layers to get to a single object, the drilling down maintains the strata of history with their proximities intact, as well as their pressures, to provide a view of an object in situ. As well, we can perhaps think about tectonic relationships of colliding plates, wherein the forms of land will meet, and yet the structural relationships or disturbances will happen elsewhere spatially. So, looking at the origin of these canton-wide assemblies, one finds the pre-modern self-organized assemblies that existed across Northern Europe and Scandinavia. These entities would come together on the premise of a common area, a village or even a larger configuration of bodies, such as a village or even a larger configuration of bodies, such as a tribe. And these earlier pre-modern forms of the Landsgemeinde would function as binding, deliberative bodies that could also be a site to reconcile disputes. So we can think today about combining the legislative and judiciative into a single site, particularly an open public site. And it is the site without the exclusive access of walls, without complex levels of representation. Instead, these pre-modern assemblies would be out in the open for all to join. They would be in open fields, which became to be called march fields or May fields, as well as trees, such as one pictured here in Germany near Baden. And there are also meetings would occur near large stones, and this is one erected near Saarbrücken. To other numerous glacial boulders, which exist in mainly Scandinavian areas, which are today called Viking rocks. These meetings would not be recorded in any fashion. Hence the decision to function as a form of temporary relations, whose judicial expanse covers as far as the entropic landscape of memory allows. This anti-historical meeting necessitates recurrence to discuss again and renew the decisions on matters of shared concern. And here comes a critical term. This pre-modern assemblies were known as Thing, or things, or in High German, Ding. So, the word for this meeting, in a way, comes down to us in the form of an inanimate object, and yet has its origins in the very living and crucial social body where agency is exercised and produced. It is in the thing itself where we find a way to potentially reconstitute a politicality within this present moment of object-oriented thinking, as opposed to a vacuous plane of objects without relations and contestations. Can we instead think of things as a gathering, as a site for critical res, or discussion? Perhaps we can invert the prism when looking at the etymology of things, to see not a past, but to project forward a way to return to a living, debating, and communal way of thinking. As Bruno Latour notes, it is matter itself which is up for grabs. And he was writing about things in a very different way in the aftermath to the Iraq invasion, or evasion by some other governments, wherein Colin Powell's presentation to the UN Security Council with elaborate diagrams, charts, and satellite photos had the appearance of fact, but instead fell under the disturbing new term of facticity. This wonderful neoliberal word, wherein supposed facts have characteristics that seem to be assigned a truth value, wherein there's actually a very different form of relations that are going on underneath. Within this new doublespeak, Latour was searching for a new objectivity and called for an object-oriented democracy, something I personally find very scary. While the thrust of this project is looking for a new regime of truth, I would like to turn away from the interchangeability in his argument of object and thing in order to start thinking about the object and thing in oppositional terms. Can we think about things in opposition to a techno-shamanistic future organized around a definitive programming language? Instead, things offer ambiguity. Things provide a reference to a field or a terrain where meaning without becoming deterministic. The boundaries of the thing are flexible and negotiable, and this becomes clear wherein how we utilize the word. We can speak of something, and yet we cannot speak of some object. Here, something refers to something which is shared and yet unknown, perhaps. Or the fact that something has disappeared and there will potentially be a return. I forgot what that thing is. There was something there, but I forgot what the thingamajig was. Something in the discussion was compelling. So here we see thing laden with a malleable temporality, right? So it's not unlike the pre-modern assemblies which had to gather and come back in a way in order to reassert themselves. When we think about something, we know where and when that thing might be, and yet it constitutes a certain terrain, but those borders can shift and move. And yet, likewise, spatially, we can think of everything, but not every object. Right? So I have lost everything, or everything there was interesting. Everything here does not conform to a rigid set of objects and references, but includes a material and affective register. I lost everything, and yet I haven't lost every object. The word points out a more inclusive entirety, and yet within this entirety we can see a certain form of shared relations, in the sense that within a shared notion of everything, something, we in a way, outside of the grammatics, have an understanding about where the reference lies within the words and potentially within the politics of the language. Okay. So, as an addendum, I'd like to shift to talk about different things, or objects in a way. And this is a project entitled Salvage Art Institute, which first took place at Arthur Ross Architecture Gallery as part of Columbia University in New York this past year. And the Salvage Art Institute is an artistic project and separate institution by Elke Krajewska, who's an artist who's based in New York. And she had gotten into discussions with AXA, the insurance agency, which insures works both in museums, private collections, galleries, etc., and had found out about total loss. So basically the fact that if you spill red wine on your painting and you want the full value, insurance value of your painting, you of course cannot keep a stained painting since it is destroyed and get the insurance money, even though this is hindering your aesthetic experience of the painting. Instead, AXA, the insurance company, will come and reclaim that painting and give you the full value of the painting. Now, what becomes interesting is its total loss, so therefore it's expected to be destroyed. Wherein, actually, AXA has a whole vault which holds onto these destroyed artworks. Some of these artworks, of course, potentially have the value of being reconditioned. And other artworks exist in this very interesting terrain where they're damaged, they will not be reconsidered, and yet they're objects which are held onto. Now, where and how do we see the distinction, of course, between kind of art, the aesthetic operation in its own right, intentionality of the artist, and this destroyed object? And within this ontological conundrum, Elke Krajewska came in and formed the Salvage Art Institute. And the Salvage Art Institute is a refuge, so to speak, for these objects. And she has taken in a number at this point in time, which is ranging. In the exhibition, there were 25 objects, and now she's up to 100. And basically, how they function is twofold. They are arranged in a space on various trolleys. The visitors can move these objects around. And then most importantly, on the left-hand side here, you can see what comes with the objects is the institutional history. The institutional history from AXA in its own right, which sets forward a whole field of relations in and around the object. So wherein one sees this kind of work as like so-called zombie art in a way, right? Like it's work that is maybe living in some half-dead state moving forward. This is my favorite example. If you all can recognize the Jeff Koons puppy, which has been smashed, destroyed, hopefully in a fit of anger at the work itself, and resides in the exhibition space. So here maybe we see questions again about objects versus things, right? Maybe held within this work. How can we see a work as a host of relations versus an object in a way? And this state of trying to kind of transition between the two and maybe shuttling past. Like, is there a form of return? Is there a potential return outside of this project for these objects? So thinking about things and thinking about objects, I'd like to stay in New York, but shift to an earlier period and think about Marolita Muglis. Marolita Muglis is an artist who was starting to work in the late 60s and had been to Pratt and NYU and was working mainly on a sculptural practice, wherein she had her second child, or actually her first child at this point in And it was this gendered role where the perception of her as an artist shifted from literally being an artist mother, to being a mother. So within this conundrum, where in public space she was seen as being the tender or carer of this child started to cannibalize her own identity. And this frustration with this certain form of feminist politics that was absent in the sphere of the art world at that point in time, she wrote a much longer and wide-ranging manifesto, which is entitled The Manifesto for a Maintenance Art. And hopefully, wonderfully, you all can see, basically, this is the form of the first part of the manifesto. And I'd just like to speak about it maybe briefly for those who haven't read it. But as you can see here, and wonderfully hopefully read here, she sets up an opposition between the death and the life instinct. And very interestingly, she thinks the death instinct as being individuality which runs its course to a certain aim, whereas the life instinct is actually perpetual renewal in a way. And as such, there's an opposition in this form between development and maintenance. Development she sees as the avant-garde, as an individual's approach to forging new terrain, and maintenance is about preserving of a certain territory. As she says, to sustain the change, to renew the excitement, repeat the fight. She sees this as a direct feedback system. And as you can wonderfully see on the side, she oscillates between a more militant political language, let's say, having a base in international relations, and forming to a very colloquial way of understanding maintenance. So she describes maintenance as, maintenance is a drag, it takes all the fucking time. The mind boggles and shakes at boredom. The culture confers lousy status on maintenance jobs. Minimum wages, housewives equal no pay. Clean your desk, wash the dishes, clean the floor, wash your clothes, wash your toes, change the baby's diaper, finish the report, correct the typos, mend the fences, keep the customer happy, throw out the stinking garbage, watch out, don't put those things in your nose, what shall I wear, I have no socks, pay your bills, don't litter, save string, wash your hair, change the sheets, go to the store, I'm out of perfume, say it again, he doesn't understand, seal it again, it leaks, go to work. This art is dusty, clear the table, call him again, flush the toilet, stay young. So within this kind of panoply of a very affective and labored relation objects, so to speak, of maintenance, we see kind of two shifts within here, which are very important, I think, in a way. One in which we see the daily form of maintenance, and I think as kind of cultural workers who are constantly performing in their domestic sphere, we see a real problem in around how we separate maintenance from work, and moreover, how therefore work becomes maintenance in its own way. And she wants to not only nod to that condition very early on in 1969, but she also shifts out to think about maintenance in a broader social sense. So thinking about maintenance here, whether it be throwing out the trash, potentially picking up the trash here, going to the store, thinking very early about customer relations here, keeping the customer happy, something with Hochschild and others would only come 2 years later. So expanding these kind of fields of where and how maintenance art functions, and then wanting to claim that in a very kind of modernist way, this is all up for game for art, in a way that, yes, we can all see this as a field of production. And this is something which maybe we can all kind of attest to at the time and was already well worn. But what becomes interesting is the fact that the manifesto shifts. So we not only see it here as a declaration, right? Like a declaration of a new form of practice, which is interesting, a declaration for way of being, but it also shifts into a proposition for an exhibition. So the second half of the manifesto is an exhibition in 3 parts, which she proposes. She actually proposed this exhibition to the Whitney Museum and called them up. And she was very surprised when this artist who they had never heard of did not accept their proposal for an exhibition. As I'm sure we all have done this similarly, but wherein the exhibition formed 3 major parts, and there was the personal. So she begins with this wonderful phrase, "I am an artist, I am a woman, I am a wife, I am a mother, random order." How will, of course, these tasks kind of come into the space? Well, they'll come into the space in a way through taking care of the visitors, through reproducing her household tasks within the space of the exhibition. And although the exhibition area might look empty of art, it will be maintained in full public view. And this is actually maybe one of the most interesting shifts here, about the invisible form of maintenance art. So her working will be work. We can shift to the general, what she calls the general form of maintenance. And by the general, she means a discursive approach, wherein she interviews others about their own maintenance activities in the space, what constitutes maintenance, even more interestingly, what is the relationship between maintenance and freedom? What is the relationship between maintenance and dreams? Thinking about a more speculative notion of maintenance as well. And finally, earth maintenance. So thinking about earth maintenance as bringing in recycling, bringing in trash into the exhibition space, which needs to be therefore maintained, sorted, and kind of brought back into the realms of circulation. So she wrote this in 1969. She called the Whitney. The Whitney didn't give her a show. Well, wonderfully, there was an art critic who found out about this and included this in art form, and this came out in 1971. So 1971, which is a wonderful time, we can really see is the beginning of maintenance art, right? 1971, at least in the US and elsewhere, is a period of real economic crisis. It's a period where kind of the post-war boom has exhausted itself, and we are now in what is soon to be the oil crisis, what is a huge period of inflation. The dollar is fluctuating. There is inflation throughout Europe as well, and there's real problems in and around the present state of the economy, the present state of society. And yet, now we see this time a return to maintenance, a return to care, which was the name of her exhibition. So, in 1973, Lucy Lepard reads this Art Forum article, calls up the critic, and says, I have to get in touch with this person. Lucy's starting her number of shows at this point in time, and of course engaged in a new form of feminist practice in the early 1970s. She calls Marilee Van and asks, "Are you a real person?" This is too good to be true. So she invites her to come on the number show and to produce her work. Well, of course, Meryl's problem is, the number show is traveling. It's going to be in Los Angeles. How and where can I find a certain form of performative maintenance in the exhibition space? And what she decides to embark on is a maintenance art album entitled Maintenance Art Tasks. And these are images from that album, which takes the form of a family album. Here you can see its original copy with the wrong title. The original copy from 1973, wherein the photos are arrayed and the book is laid out, and so individuals go through hundreds of photographs and take over a similar time, let's say, as the activity would unfold. So you see, this is one of the first projects, which is laundry, and laundry consists of 92 images, and so a number of pages wherein putting the laundry in the chute, taking the laundry down, bringing it downstairs, putting it in the laundry machine, her child coming down to visit her, unfolding, drying, this kind of laborious sense of actually, like within maintenance activities, the plethora of experience that resides and making visible this experience. So no longer can we reduce laundry down to a simple word, down to a simple task. So here's an image of her doing the laundry in her basement building in the Bronx. This is her washing of this wonderful plate. And she will have a whole series of going through a whole meal, washing, and then expanding out into the social realm as well, which is very interesting. So this is not Meryl and not her child, but rather wonderful invasion of patient privacy, asked to photograph others who come to the doctor's office, and so there's a series of children being photographed. being looked after by their doctor. And finally, even kind of manual labor here is a form of maintenance. And this is in Soho, in New York, with excavators. So the exhibition happened in '73, and flash forward to a show in New York where a critic writes, well, if you can do maintenance art, why don't you contact the Department of Sanitation, because New York's going into bankruptcy and they need money, and you can have a huge art project with the whole Department of Sanitation, and they can get National Endowment for the Arts grants for being an arts organization. So she takes this very kind of slight criticism, mails it off to the head of the sanitation department. He reads this letter and actually takes her at her word, gives her a call, and says, would you like to come do an artwork with 10,000 people? So she's invited into the Department of Sanitation, which cleans the streets of New York and also takes the trash and disposes of the trash in the city of New York. And she joins in 1977 as an artist in residence, and is given office space and no salary, but she's invited to do a work, and she insists on a year research period before, where she travels around and visits with the various people and their stations and decides that what she's going to give the sanitation department is visibility in its own right. Visibility as well as recognition. And in this way, very personal recognition. So she is going to shake the hand of every sanitation worker and tell them thank you for keeping New York alive. She expects this work will take 3 months. She begins it in 1979 in the summer, and it actually lasts almost a year up until the following summer. And she would travel to the various stations, she would travel to the dumps and meet workers in these various locations. So, coming together to do a project with 3 others in New York this past, let's say beginning in the previous fall and moving into the spring, one question around the Maintenance Art Manifesto that really struck in this moment of kind of post-Occupy to post it here was, after the revolution, who's going to pick up the garbage on Monday? And I think it's this phrase, in a way, which really encapsulates a number of problematic we have in terms of, first of all, after the revolution, who's going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning? What revolutionary state are we in within this phrase, right? Even more so, how is this organization for our very basic public services? Even more so, are the basic public services themselves kind of holding back any form of social transformation? And as we saw in Occupy, as we saw in here, it was actually sanitation itself which was used as the reason to move people out of the space, right? So where can we see kind of revolutionary forms of maintenance? But maybe more so, how can we understand maintenance in the way that Merrill has put this forward? First, a more critical understanding of maintenance. First, an understanding of maintenance wherein maintenance is something which both provides us with a certain amount of sustainable living, and it also creates a horizon of possibilities which is potentially limited, right? How far can we go off the grid of electricity? How far can we move in and around society in terms of the ordering of streets, in terms of the ordering of constructions of boundaries, and the institution of private property, and the sustaining of this institution? So where and when does maintenance have this double-edged sword? Right? So we came together and thought about this exhibition, which is entitled The Maintenance Required. Thinking about practices led by Meryl and Euclides, and then very much that contrast with her. So here you can see a slide inside the kitchen of 2 videos which were done by Meryl during the period. One which is the sanitation worker speaking, which is an extremely important part of the project. This is a time where conditions in the sanitation department were appalling. They were in unheated shacks with open toilets, so allowing the conditions to be exposed and to be on tape in the exhibition space. The next video is called Waste Flow, where she tracks the flow of our garbage in New York. And then an exhibition poster for the right, which lays out kind of maps of the sanitation system and to kind of show this underbelly, invisible work of what is sustaining New York, and slides from the image to the right. But very quickly, there is this notion again of how Merrill, which puts forward, somewhat of a positive view of maintenance in its own right, be contrasted with a very different approach. And here, the artist Sam Waite, who's based in New York, created this work which is entitled Test Dust, A7 fine, and then it has the number of the fine. And what this is actually a fighter pilot's helmet from 1970s, covered in test dust. And what is test dust? Test dust is actually manufactured dirt. It is manufactured grains at various degrees so that electronics companies, and particularly the military-industrial complex, can train both their soldiers and their equipment in various combat areas, let's say. So how? This was actually kind of coming out of the Gulf War, where a number of trucks broke down in the first invasion of Iraq, which of course is not a problem. The second one, thanks to this man-made dust. So you can create geographic conditions of dust and then try them out on motors, try them out on iPads, etc. So it also kind of comes into consumer products as well. Maybe Terrence Simon on the right here, with her very popular series, as I'm sure you all know, an index of the hidden and unfamiliar in America. The image on the left actually is a cable, which is the transatlantic cable, one of only a handful which carry all of the internet and voice traffic that come from Europe to the US. And interestingly, this is the first site where it reaches landfall. And if you can see this small barrier, this is a very banal office space with a purpose-built stanchions around it, basically so that the cleaning lady will not accidentally run the waxer into the cable and knock out transatlantic discussion. So where and how do we see the fragility of a different form of technological maintenance as well? And more so kind of the physicality of this maintenance, which is extremely important. The physicality of the maintenance, not only in terms of the systems themselves, but in terms of the labor that's required to sustain the very structure, which we see as something, usually the internet, which is light, floating around us, ephemeral, and yet requires this very heavy infrastructure. And the image to the right is an HIV, a live HIV virus, so also thinking here about the maintenance of the body. Maybe, I don't know how I'm doing on time.
Pretty good. 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. I'll maybe talk about just a couple more examples, and then we can wrap up and speak. This is actually a really interesting example that I might hold off on for a moment. So this is the Salvage Art Institute, which we saw before, and this was a work that was not included in the previous show in Columbia. Instead, this work is entitled Not In Show, by an artist, a little-known artist based in Providence, Rhode Island. But it was actually an interesting, the artwork itself came from the Art in Embassies program. And the Art in Embassies program is an American program that encourages donation and a circulation of artworks in and around embassy sites to fulfill an ideological function. So this artwork had been destroyed in transit, coming back, and it's displayed not only as itself, but it's displayed with all of its packing material here. And it's displayed on a cart, which of course is mobile throughout, but one is allowed to both touch the work, to go through the packing material, and how and where the object Thanking relations maybe take a hold here, and more so, how and where do we see the circulation of art functioning, right? The circulation of art functioning both in maybe its post-art position, as well as the art embassy program, as well as the maintenance, which of course all of you and all of us undergo as cultural workers of shipping, packing, the inherent fragility in the system, and moreover the amount of time which is required. And the time which is required comes in very strongly in the work of Karen Sander. And Karen Sander's work here is a wall polishing piece. And this work is actually the result of a week of polishing with the highest grade of sandpaper down to the finest grade of sandpaper. And working through each level until the sandpaper literally is like velvet, which one is moving across the surface. The surface which becomes glass and becomes reflective. So we see this highly aestheticized object, which is the result of a very definitive portion of labor, and yet distinct from that form of work. And interestingly enough, usually this functions as a very white mirrored surface, if you all had seen these before. But in this instance, there was a Chantal Ackerman show two exhibitions before the maintenance show, and they painted the whole gallery black for her video installation. And so we see this very unintended, let's say, abstract composition, which comes through, and in the middle you can even see more of a history of a wall where there's potentially a footprint of a pissed-off installation worker off to the right as well. So how do we understand kind of the archaeology of the exhibition space itself, right? The archaeology of the exhibition space is having multiplicity of histories which maybe are not represented or which lie dormant within the site itself. And finally, coming back maybe to the last work, you see the Bronx-based artist here who had decided to clean hallways in New York during the 1980s. If you know anything about New York in the 1980s, it was not a hospitable place to live. And even more so in the Bronx, which had just gone through a period which was known as burning. The Bronx is burning, where landlords would burn down their buildings in order to get insurance money, which is an interesting form of maintenance in relation to its own. And so within this period, the artist takes on the task of the maintenance worker and goes once a week to clean various halls inside the public spaces of public buildings, which the city has neglected. And this work, which silently went on for a year, was documented in a few photographs, and then decided to take this project of cleaning on the road, so to speak. And thinking about cleaning as a therapeutic action, he went to a site where there was slave deportation going on, the Côte d'Ivoire, and also went to Japan, to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the atomic bombs had exploded. And interestingly enough, to the Tokyo's main subway station, where sarin gas had just been released by a radical group. And so thinking here about cleaning in an operative sense, very wonderfully, this position of the artist is called into question in terms of one's own visibility, not only within the work, but within the donning of the uniform, right? And I was going to say, as a side note, my geographic fatigue and my own bodily maintenance is beginning together. But let's say that there's somebody who works very similarly, whose name is escaping me at this very moment. And basically, this wonderful African-American artist who teaches at SVA who's very well known, you all know, did a project where he was going to give a lecture about his solo exhibition in the Met, and asked his friends to come, and he would give a guided tour to all of them. And being African American, he met them all in the gallery space, and then extricated himself from the situation and said he'd be back in 5 minutes. He donned a guard's uniform and came back into the exhibition space and stood in front of them, and everybody was talking amongst themselves. And nobody recognized his position and his transformation. I mean, good friends. So where and how, the maintenance workers, who he finally introduces himself and brings his group on a tour. Which then the visitors find very interesting, that this guard is so informative and actually leading the group. So where and how do we see these kind of positions, as being potentially interchangeable in a way? So if we see kind of Merrill and Zucli's manifesto as an insistence for a form of maintenance art in a way, how have we as cultural workers, I think, in a very different system, taken on the form of maintenance workers? Maintenance workers which require tasks not only for the production but work for the sustaining of ourselves, for the sustaining of the work itself, for the sustaining of practice. And it seems ever more pressing now that maintenance itself is certainly not an object, but maintenance itself is a very undefined thing, right? Maintenance, the boundaries of maintenance now has really been radically dismantled. And within this kind of maintenance paradigm, of which we're increasingly more involved in and subject to, is potentially, there's potentially a recognition of maintenance, which is extremely critical to this moment as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And I'm very interested in your questions and hopefully a discussion we have around anything you would like to discuss.
So I suggest we turn on the lights.
Yeah, this would be great.
So are there any questions from the audience? We can also translate if somebody doesn't feel that fit with English.
Yeah, exactly. Translation is an important maintenance task as well. We all do.
Oh. That means now that brings me to the position to make the first question. Now, I just want to make a remark because you mentioned Karen Sander, which is also teaching at the architecture school here at the ETH. He's a professor for visual arts, but in the architecture department. And we were talking about her work like 2 days before at the class, like policing the. We were talking about concept art and things like that, and then she made this work like policing the 4 corners of a wall in an exhibition space, like highlighting the wall as in the white cube, let's say, and then she had this other work like policing only the corners, really make it really like shiny, and then you saw this other work of her where she somehow followed the history of the wall, what it has been, and it was, let's say, nice coincidence that you mentioned this kind of her work in general.
There's another work as well.
Yeah.
Have you all seen the algorithm as well? Wherein there's an algorithm which is printed in and around the wall, and the algorithm is actually an algorithm of the space itself. So in a way, this translation between the space into language which, if you can gather from my talk, I am very distrustful of in a certain way. But in a way, it actually, I think, provides a very fascinating instance of how and where we can see the space around us as having latent technologies in them, or having this kind of relationship in, like, let's say, a more equalized form of objects. And I guess I had just heard from one of her assistants that supposedly the 3D models as well, which I'm sure you're well aware of, where she does 3D representations of herself and others, are actually tracking the technology, which is very interesting. And so they become either larger or smaller, in focus, out of focus, depending on kind of the present trends. And I think it's like potentially the fallibility within the objects, wherein there's a certain interest that lies in thinking about a certain form of maintenance, maybe, that we see in and around these 3D printing, as both a form of production as well as the production of objects and maintenance in their own right. Like, there's discussions around 3D printing as being able to be shot up into space so that you can replicate any object that you need in distant ways. And yet, this would be seen as kind of an avant-gardist move that actually positions maintenance as its only critical position for any form of movement. But yeah, I think Sander has a really fascinating, very diverse practice. But I guess I'm curious, because this is this first instantiation of this talk, I guess I'm curious about your relationship, particularly with what was brought up in a very local context, but with the Landsgemeinde. And I know there's at least one person here who's from Bars, where there is a Landsgemeinde. But I think I'm curious about kind of view kind of this like very publicness in a way where, you know, this is also obviously like pushed against, right? Like, there used to be a larger number, and now there's down to 2, there used to be 7, and now there's notions of privacy, there's notions of accuracy in a way around this. But I guess I'm kind of curious about ideals, ideas, notions, speculations, anything that's open. Does anyone have an opinion about this?
Have you been in this assembly in Glarus? Can you just say your impressions or how these things function?
Das ist etwas so abgelaufen.
He says it's over.
No.
Abgelaufen. Du weißt, abgelaufen hat. Wie ist abgelaufen? I'm not the best translator.
Du kannst einfach auf Deutsch, muss nicht auf Englisch.
Ja, das meine ich.
Ja, es hat einfach diesen großen Holzring und ein Rednerpult. Und jeder, es gibt dann die Zocktanten, über die man abstimmen kann. Und jeder aus dem Volk, der möchte, kann dort hochgehen und seine Rede halten. Und am Schluss wird dann per Handzeichen abgestimmt.
So he says it's just basically what you showed, it's this round, and then they have this drop down to will be spoken about, and everybody can go up to the speaker's position and have a speech. And at the very end, there are the things that people do report.
Do you go regularly?
Sorry?
Do you participate regularly? Or have you only participated one time? Or have you gone back?
No, just one time.
Just one time.
It's a bit boring.
How long was the duration? How long were you there for?
Wie lange geht das Ganze?
Es ist verschieden. Meistens um die 4-5 Stunden.
Does it shift towards an older demographic then? Are there mainly older people who are participating?
No, from 16 till 90 years.
Do family members participate? Do your family members?
Yeah, they do. They don't speak, just for the vote.
En justice? Justice?
Ja, sehr viele Politiker oder ganz normale Leute. Also kaum erwähnt.
Yeah.
So, no.
But for a long time, only men could vote. It was, I think, just recently it was a really
Yeah, this is.
I think it was the same year when in Switzerland generally it was about
It's nice to see the
Yes,
artistical
certainly
differences.
means like the men enter and the women
Outside.
And it's obviously a much larger form. Or the structure of the circle as well, moving out into the oval. It's really interesting to see how the geometries are reflected in the space.
So das mit dem späten Stimmrecht für Frauen, das ist aber nicht klar, das ist ab und zu.
Yeah, this was 83, I think, the last canton that.
no late.
No, later.
92, I think. Klaus was I think in the 70s.
Yes, Oh, I thought at the beginning of the 80s. But maybe to go back to your different approaches of labor, let's say, in Oslo. I like that you made all this, all this difference, but also very common based on like cultural workers or like care workers, or because we are at some point cultural workers and care workers at the same time, and I think it's somehow interesting to see how this is a topic in the art field, and how different artists can deal with this. I wouldn't say different identities, because the whole thing is the identity, but how we define labor today somehow, and how we define work, how we define work of art, a piece of art, or work of art, how we define different labors from immaterial labor to the manual labor, and so on. So I think that was nice going around all these different approaches that you did.
Yeah, I think there's actually a really interesting distinction that Hannah Arendt makes as well between work and labor. Mm-hmm. And she says, the fact that labor is something which is personal. Labor is a matter of taking care of oneself. Labor is done within the domestic sphere. And yet, work is something which is done for another, which is a very interesting point. So there is no kind of self-work, self-employment. And that work and labor are very distinct and in opposition to oneself, even though they're in kind of mutual necessity. And then she says that it's only action, which is wherein politicality lies. And action occurs outside of the home. It occurs in public space with others. And I think it's something that's it's actually a very interesting categorization, because it's something that we've almost lost in a way. Like, we've lost a vocabulary to speak about the differentiation of labor and work.
And there is also the third term, occupation. If you say that it's an occupation, you occupy time by doing something, so you're like, you have an occupation somehow. Like, it's, I don't know exactly what if it's in between work and labor, and where occupation can be both somehow. But if we turn this into the art producers model, let's say, it's not clear when it is work and when it is labor, and how do you find out which is the value of this labor? Like, and you have different approaches. That people say we are artists and we are art workers, we are laborers somehow, and others would say no, it's only the product of our labor that has a value, but not the labor itself. I mean, I don't know, staying three months in the studio and producing, or going out of the studio, make research. This is all part of our labor somehow, that we do it for ourselves, but also for the other, but it's not automatically recognized as work. And then we start to think about piece as a work of art when we come to the end product or to the end presentation, or things like that.
Yeah, I think that the timing itself is really crucial about the distinction. It's a really good point. The occupation itself is certainly something where that hinges on, and I think I agree with the majority of your statement. And I have to say, I think ironically one of the few places that we find a real equality for the notion of research and work is in the tax code, where of course we can see where and how there's actually structural systems that want to kind of understand and encourage a certain form of research. So therefore, like this, of course, and
so maybe my question somehow relates to what you said, because I'm curious about like what is the relationship between what you're speaking about, like this maintenance question, like how maintenance, like in Jelle's work, is being represented in everyday life, and then how it is being represented in the exhibition itself.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I have the same question, because it seemed like it's already, the works you showed seem pre-maintained or like showed in a way that they're better to maintain. You know, a frame example for a photograph, for a photograph is already there to maintain it, or there you could read it that way. Or like I was interested in that there are no artists, or you didn't show everything, but made works that screamed for maintaining. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's a very, and I think it's part of the thrust as well, to like where and how we understand maintenance, not only as a relational activity which goes on, but as something which can exist in a different form. And I think it's that different form which we wanted to highlight. In around how we understand the performative elements of maintenance as being able to be transferred into, I think, the objects. And as a very interesting form of a kind of within the realm of Salvage Art Institute, and a non-performative performance. Thanks to the lender of Terence Simon's work, and this would be good if you all joined the Gaussian Gallery in the future, due to the value of the work, we were forced to have a guard. So we're actually paying for a maintenance worker, as well as ourselves being maintenance workers in the space, in some way, which I think set up this very kind of wonderful form of relationship in terms of how one understands both the systems, of course, of labor, the systems of value function behind the work, but how the work unfolds and how the work necessitates labor. And in that case, the work had a certain unperformed performativity due to the circulation of value. But I think in a sense, it's also about seeing maintenance as something which doesn't necessitate its physical presence in a very kind of forthright way, in terms of how we have a very complicated relationship with the visibility of maintenance and how our own work, of course, as artists and cultural workers, gets complicated in terms of its translation into what on our end would decide to be work as opposed to labor. And it's something which actually, interestingly enough, along a similar way, Meryl Nucleus was able to work with us to put on a performance that she had wanted to do since '77, which was actually to serve the maintenance workers lunch. And these were maintenance workers who worked in Chelsea, and Chelsea at that point in time had just been through Hurricane Sandy, and Hurricane Sandy created a huge water rush, as I'm sure you all heard or saw, which destroyed a large number of galleries as well as the kitchen itself. And what became interesting is the fact that, yes, of course, the printed matter archives were out on the street, and yes, there were artworks which were also being tossed out. It's the maintenance workers who are kind of dealing with this aftermath. The maintenance workers being the sanitation workers. And interestingly enough, the second largest commodity is drywall, which is maybe not so much a surprise. But nonetheless, it's drywall and objects, which is the currency of the art world of Chelsea. But these stories and others, I think, were able to kind of come out in a very different sphere, right? Like eschewing their maintenance in order to shift the maintenance. So the maintenance is therefore on us to cook and serve them. So in a way, the exhibition is speaking about a deferred maintenance, I think, in that way. And trying to kind of be very forthright about how maintenance can potentially operate or be translated into different spheres. So this, and I think that's extremely important too, because I think there are kind of multiple projects, and I think there are multiple political projects in a way. And I think this exhibition did take on a certain form of kind of bodiless politicality within its own way. But it's something which I can certainly understand as a point. And there was discussions about kind of a further development of the show as well.
Gibt's andere Fragen? Okay.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's also, maybe it would be also interesting for people just to know a bit more about how you, I don't know, how you find the artists that you're interested in, or how you work with the artists or something like this. I can imagine that there's a question.
Yeah, it's actually, I think it's a very good question, and it's a question that I always find surprisingly difficult to answer. And I think because it depends on the practice in its own right, and where and how one, I think, understands a relationship to contemporaneity and to certain issues, and where and how relationships unfold within both the intellectual sphere of production and the material sphere of production. This is all to say that there's no very easy answer for this question. But it's to say that very much an artist-led approach, I think, is something which is very critical. And I think formats are also extremely very critical within this. And so let's not speak about methodologies, but let's just speak about practice. So in a way, my practice, I've never worked with Rashkar, Mahmoud Mustafa. And yet, this is a work which has very little visibility. It's a work that I met Rashkar on a trip to Iraq in 2010. And since then, she's now studying in London, I believe at Chelsea. But it's a work which is of critical value, I think, to not only understanding how we can kind of understand a certain moment, but even more so, how this work operates through a number of different registers, and within it is continually concealing something as well. And I haven't worked with her, maybe for a lot of reasons, but it's something that I always come back to in this format, in a way. And so where and how we can think about different forms of collaboration in a sense too. And I can say that working with Marilyn Euclid has been a very unique experience in the sense that, of course, it's working with somebody who has had their practice for 40 years, and this sets up a very, very different dynamic. But I can say that a dynamic that is actually very much antithetical, although Marilyn is very spontaneous. Yeah, it's like, let's say it becomes a relationship where it takes on more of a discursive form than the actual production. You can certainly, I know I'm being very evasive with this question in a sense, but I'm trying to kind of maybe speak about certain points and ways and points of access. Because I think there is no, it's a very similar question, I think, would be functioning from a different direction. But I would like to say, as a footnote to this, which is very nice, speaking about the tax code, the U.S., and maybe we can wrap up on this depending on whether you all have more questions. So the U.S. keeps track of all different labor positions over the year. And included in these labor positions are fine artists, ceramicists, curators, and everything else, electricians, and the like. So, turns out for 2012, if you are a fine artist in the United States of America, now, you're listed as a fine artist, etc. We all know whatever this might mean, there's a whole different place. You're obviously supporting yourself as a fine artist. You are making $53,000, which is, I don't know if many artists make $53,000. Now, if you're a curator in 2012, how much money are you making? And this is like, you're making money for, living as a curator, the very same way as a fine artist. There's always lots of questions. Well, curators make less because they're working in like small arts institutions, or they're going to make more because they're working in whatever it might be. Curators make $53,000 in the US, which is shocking. Personally, I'm shocking. So this is to say that I think that there's a certain economic inequality in a way, which maybe has been long known and yet has not been objectified in a sense. And I think it's very much kind of this form of this way in which kind of practices converge through circumstances. And I think when we think about kind of collaboration along horizontal lines, as well as very distinct roles, I think it's very important to see that, all projects are artist-led due to the condition of our work, our role as curators. And B, there's a very fundamental equality in terms of being cultural workers. Which is substantiated by a very hierarchical maintenance system of tracking operations. So maybe if there's any other questions, we can speak personally, which might be easier for some.
You can join us, going for a drink after the lecture. Somewhere here around, invited to come, to join.
Thank you.
Thank you.